Good evening and welcome. I thank everybody for coming out tonight. I know it's not easy taking times out of your life to come and understand some of these issues that we face here in town. I am happy to see everybody here tonight. With me to my left is Fred Sivian from the state. He is with DEP from Stormwater Coordinator. To my right is Jean Walker. She's a member of the Stormwater Advisory Committee. My name is Megan Dos Anjos. I'm the conservation agent here in town. I act as an ex officio member to the Stormwater Advisory Committee. We're going to get started. Fred is going to start with his presentation, and we'll go from there.
Thanks, Megan. Appreciate it. Gentleman here asked me what I did for a job. My name is Fred Sivian. My answer is I work for you, work for the State Department of Environmental Protection. So if you pay taxes, you pay part of my salary. My job is to be a stormwater coordinator, to be able to explain federal, state, and local stormwater rules to anyone who asks. One of the other things I do is try to help towns that are trying to do better stormwater management. There are lots of reasons that towns try to do better stormwater management, one of them being a permit that's coming up fairly soon. There are other reasons too. Before I start with my presentation, which here's my contact information, my email address. My telephone number is 617-292-5821. Feel free to call. I'm old enough to have been around during the first Earth Day as an adult. Since 1970, and that's what, 48 years ago now, the United States and all its states have done a really good job of cleaning up water pollution. Back in that day, only about a third of the nation's rivers, streams were swimmable and fishable. Now about 2/3 of them are. So we've done a really good job of reducing the pollution that comes from a relatively small number of large pipes, from wastewater treatment plants, from industrial facilities, from paper plants. We've done a good job of ratcheting down the pollution there. But when my colleagues at DEP and people at EPA go out and study rivers, streams, lakes, and ponds, we find out that they're still too polluted to meet federal or state water quality standards. They're not swimmable or fishable. And when we looked further, we found that in Massachusetts, the single largest source of pollution was pollution carried by stormwater. Rainwater falling on impervious surface, on roads, on roofs, on sidewalks, gathering those pollutants up and washing them into the catch basins. Now, stormwater systems don't have any treatment in them. A wastewater plant, a sewage plant, whatever gets flushed into the pipes for the sewage plant goes and gets treated. But stormwater is different. Whatever goes into the catch basins is very efficiently sent right to the rivers and streams. So whatever pollutants are gathered up gets put efficiently into those lakes, rivers, and streams. So from an environmental perspective, we know that we have pollution of our rivers and streams, and the question is, what do we do about that? One of the things that people wonder is, well, why are we all of a sudden paying attention to stormwater? If I could have the first slide. Basically, you've been doing stormwater management in Ashland for decades and decades. I don't know when your first catch basins were put in or when you first had stormwater pipes, but you've been gathering up stormwater to keep it off roads, to keep it out of people's basements, and to put it into the stormwater system for public safety reasons for a long time. The stormwater started getting regulated in the 1990s. In Massachusetts, Boston and Worcester were the first two cities to be regulated. But since 2003, Ashland and 239 other towns have all been doing better stormwater management because of a permit issued by EPA. This MS4 permit stands for Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System, is basically a permit for the town to discharge its stormwater into surface waters, into rivers and streams. Towns are responsible for doing work, better stormwater management, in order to keep their permission to be able to put that stormwater into the lakes and rivers and streams. This permit was fairly general. It had about 36 requirements in it. In 2016, the EPA adopted a successor permit that is much more specific in what it requires towns to do. Instead of about 36 sets of requirements, there are over 200 specific requirements in this permit. That's one of the things I'm going to talk about in a little while, about why they have those requirements. The permit was slated originally to take effect on July 1st, 2017. It was postponed for a year and is now slated to take effect July 1st of this year. Next slide. What this shows is from a state perspective. I work for State Department of Environmental Protection. It just shows that whether you're in Cape Cod, Eastern Massachusetts, Central Mass, or out in the Berkshire areas, there are a lot of water resources to protect. The red you see here are rivers and streams that are not swimmable or fishable. They don't meet federal or state water quality standards. Some of the other things shown in this map, the light green are wetlands. There are some water supply protection areas on the map too. Well, the intent of this map is to show you that we're a pretty water-rich state, but we have a lot of resources to protect, both for environmental reasons and also to protect our water supplies. This is a map showing Ashland here. This is a map from the federal EPA. It has a cross-hatch to show the urbanized area. This MS4 permit I was talking about earlier is required to be adopted, required to be used in towns that have urbanized area. Now, some of Ashland isn't urbanized. The permit is not in effect in that particular area. But for the rest of Ashland, basically, the MS4 permit requirements take hold. Most other cities and towns have most of their property, the property in town is within the urbanized area and some not. Take the town of Ipswich, for example. It has some urbanized area, fairly small area, and then a lot of unurbanized area around it. So depending on the town, this MS4 permit either encompasses a large part of town or a smaller part of town. So what's in the permit? Just wanted to go through a little bit about what the permit generally requires. These 6 minimum control measures are like chapters in the permit, if it were a chapter book. Since we're in elementary school, I can talk about chapter books. The first is a requirement for public education. People need to know what's going on with the stormwater program. The second is public involvement, things like having a stormwater advisory committee. I'm going to skip over this one for now and talk about construction site runoff. The permit requires a town to have rules that limit the amount of sediment that gets created for construction projects. More than an acre in size, the town has to have adopted rules that limit the amount of sediment that gets created. There always is sediment created in construction, but you have to figure out ways to limit that. This post-construction basically answers the question of once you build something, what happens to the stormwater? It can go into underground chambers, it can go into flood detention basins, it can go into infiltration basins, it can go into rain gardens, it can go into dry wells, but the town has to have adopted rules that say what's supposed to happen with stormwater after something has been built. This last one, good housekeeping pollution prevention, and what I'm going to talk about in a minute, are big drivers of costs at a local level. Because what these requirements say is that a town has to take care of its facilities in the same way that private businesses take care of their facilities too. These good housekeeping requirements are basically schools, DPW yards, transfer stations, anything owned by the town needs to be managed by stormwater. And to give you an idea about the difference between the current permit for 2003 and the permit that's coming, it was adopted in 2016, the 2003 permit said you have to have some rules for taking care of stormwater from your facilities. In general, it was about that short. The 2016 permit goes on for 3 or 4 pages on all the different things the town has to do. For example, if the town has any refueling facilities, any places where oils or other pollutants are gathered, the town has to develop what's called a stormwater pollution prevention plan. That's something that any industry has to develop, but because these town facilities are like industrial uses, you need to develop stormwater pollution prevention plans to say how you're going to manage the stormwater on site. This last one I'm going to talk about, illicit discharge detection and elimination. Remember earlier when I was saying that whatever goes into a stormwater system doesn't get treated? This is a requirement that should check your stormwater system to make sure it's just stormwater in it. So imagine you're in DPW, it's the summertime, it hasn't rained for about 10 days. You pop open a catch basin, look down and you see flow. If you see flow there, It's not stormwater, it hasn't rained for a while. So there's some requirements in the 2016 permit that say you have to use test strips and things like that to be able to see what's in that water. Does it have surfactants in it? These are things that you find from laundry detergents. Does it have E. coli or enterococcus, which are indicators of human sewage? If you do have any of those indicators of pollutants in the stormwater system, then the permit requires you to figure out where they came from. Now that sounds like a fairly easy and simple thing to do, but if you're working in the town, you've got a catch basin that serves about 30, 40 houses. Look up the hill, how are you going to tell where it's coming from? It's going to take a lot of time and energy to go through the investigation needed to find your illicit discharges, detect where they're coming from, and then eliminate them. There are two other parts of the permit too. These water quality-based requirements that basically say if you know that a surface water is impaired, it doesn't meet federal or state water quality standards, then there are additional steps you have to take to be able to deal with those. A lot of these additional steps are not things that cost a lot of money, require you to build a lot of structures. It's more information provided to people who live around lakes and ponds. For example, if you live around a lake or pond and you've got grass clippings, don't throw the grass clippings down into the pond. Keep them away from the pond, because those grass clippings end up polluting the pond, causing there to be more oxygen demand on the pond, causing it to lose oxygen, the fish die, etc. So you can have problems with, unless you're able to tell people how to be able to manage their properties around where you have lakes and ponds. So remember that slide I had about the whole state? This is the part of that slide that deals with Ashland. There are these reds, then don't get alarmed, it's just an indicator we have on our map that says that those surface waters are not meeting federal, state, and water quality standards, and a plan has to be developed on how to get them back to meet the standards. That plan is called a TMDL. I'm sorry to get a little jargony, but it means total maximum daily load. And imagine if you've got a river or stream, if it only had this much pollution in it, it would be swimmable and fishable. Every stream has some amount of pollution in it. But when we go ahead and assess that river or stream, we find out there's this much pollution. The question is, what's the total maximum daily load of pollutants that that river or stream can handle and meet water quality standards? Then the pollutants need to be reduced down to that level. So for example, the town where I'm in is in the Charles River watershed. Part of Ashland's also in the Charles River watershed. We're responsible in Dedham for reducing the amount of pollution that water is impaired for, phosphorus, by 54%. So you've got to reduce by 54%, the thinking being if we reduce, all other towns reduce, all other uses reduce, it'll be swimmable and fishable again. These other, there are also wetlands in Ashland, there are water supply areas in Ashland too, but this is just to give you an idea that independent of the permit, you have waters that you want to protect. There may even be waters that even if there were no permit at all, that you would want to protect just because you want to do that for the town of Ashland. That sort of leads into why we're doing stormwater management. Basically, there are three reasons to do better stormwater management. One is because there are things you do for your town anyway. The catch basins to prevent flooding, to keep water from freezing on your streets, to keep water out of people's basements. You're going to do that work anyway, whether there's a permit or not. Second reason to do better stormwater management is there is an existing permit that's been in effect since 2003. The third reason is that towns are starting to get ready for the new MS4 permit. It's got more specific requirements in it. And one of the things that's difficult for a town is that while the old permit could be handled by DPW, it's not just DPW anymore. There are specific requirements in this new permit for the Parks Department, for schools, for planning, for the zoning board, for Concom, so wherever you look in town government, you're going to find responsibilities under the permit that are required. Now, towns have a lot of flexibility for how they do that. You could, if you wanted to, for example, have your health department be the one in charge of illicit discharges. Or it could be DPW, Or it could be the Conservation Commission. Each town needs to figure out how they're going to do that. For the requirements for a stormwater pollution prevention plan, if you have any transfer stations or any refueling facilities, I'm not sure who the lead is going to be in your town for doing that. It might be your DPW, but it might be another part of town government too. And that's something you need to work out, which is why some towns, like yours, have established a stormwater advisory committee to start figuring out what those answers are. Ask the questions and get them to figure it out over time. The other thing that towns are facing is this new permit, because of the specificity of requirements, is going to cause towns to have to spend more money to reduce the pollution and be able to meet the requirements of the permit. Different towns are taking different approaches to doing that. My understanding is that your town's looking at a stormwater enterprise fund, some sort of stormwater fee. That's a bona fide way to be able to pay for the better stormwater management that you're going to be doing. It's certainly fine for towns to use just taxes to be able to do that. One of the things that some towns are bumping into, though, is the issue of equitability. Is it equitable for all the stormwater work to be paid for just by properties that pay taxes? Because there are properties in town that don't pay taxes, too. This is would be an enterprise fund, just like you'd have an enterprise fund for sewage or water, based on how much people are using. What some other towns have done, I'm thinking of Milton, for example, as they just adopted a stormwater utility where all properties in town ended up paying a little bit into the fund. They did that in part because they wanted to have an equitable distribution of the costs. They didn't want some properties in town not to have to pay anything and other properties to pay what end up feeling to them as more of their share. So it's a discussion that towns are having about how equitably a system you should use to be able to pay for stormwater. Is it more equitable to have taxes? Is it more equitable to have a fee? And that's something your town needs to decide. This is the end of my presentation. I'm also here to answer any questions that you folks have or anybody here has about stormwater, about this permit. Maybe Megan, if you could coordinate the...
Sure. Whose hand did you see first? Yeah, we'll do the residents first. Residents first?
Yeah. So if you could come up to the microphone, that way, because it's not just people here that are listening, but it's being shown, it's going to be shown on WACA.
Right, that was quick. Could you go over some of the different chemicals that show up in the water and kind of give an explanation of where they come from and how you go about reducing the contact metals or any of
Yeah, what are the different kinds of pollutants you typically find in a stormwater system? What I'm doing is looking at the permit and looking at the requirements for dry weather testing. Again, if it hasn't rained for a while, pop the catch basin cover and see if there's anything there. Testing for ammonia, which could indicate people's washing machines accidentally having their exhaust or their waste going into the stormwater system. Checking for chlorine. That can indicate whether there's some potable water that's leaking into the stormwater system. Conductivity, salinity. The big ones are E. coli or Enterococcus. Those are indications of human sewage. And that can come when if a town had areas where there were a bunch of septic tanks that were disconnected for a new sewer system coming in, there can be sewage left in those areas that's making its way into the stormwater system, that's in turn making its way into the rivers and streams. That's a fairly common thing. I mentioned surfactants earlier. The pollutant of concern for the Charles River with its TMDL is phosphorus. Phosphorus comes from a lot of different places. People think automatically of fertilizers and things like that. Because I used to work in our air programs, what I think of is regional transport from the Midwest of coal and coal exhaust and also exhaust from cars being transported here has phosphorus in it. The tailpipe emissions have phosphorus in them. Those green things that fall from the trees in May or so, loaded with phosphorus. Those dry on the road, get crushed up as cars drive on them. They waft into the air, and they end up going on roofs and all. That's how you can get pollution from rooftops. It's not that anybody's up there dropping fertilizer on rooftops, but that phosphorus comes to be located on roofs, on sidewalks, and a lot of different places.
So I have a cistern at home, so I catch my rainwater, and so I'm wondering about phosphorus with that. But I'm more concerned with, so what are some things that we can do if we're really interested in this and we want to reduce our stormwater runoff? What can we do? And with something like a cistern, where not all of my roof water, but a lot of it goes to the cistern first, that's then used in my yard.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything that's going to reduce the amount of fees that we will be paying, or if we, if we convert our driveway to a permeable pavement driveway, will that reduce our fees?
Yeah.
That's something that we have talked about, and we're debating about that, but we definitely are keeping that in mind. In fact, we've had some citizens that have brought that up for us to talk about. So we are certainly considering that as, and again, what is equitable, how do you go about doing it, and to make it happen.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, from an environmental perspective, there's a woman did her graduate study in my hometown. Long story short, took 3 different neighborhoods in Dedham, where I live, one from the 40s, one from the 50s and 60s. And her research question was, if everybody did a little bit on their property, put in some dry wells, put in some cisterns, put a trench drain at the bottom of their driveway, put in a little rain garden, if everybody did that, what would be the effect on the load on the stormwater system? She calculated there'd be a 24% reduction of flow going into a stormwater system. One of the things I didn't talk about with the permit, and this gets back to why towns are doing better stormwater management, is whether there's a permit or not, your town has to pay for all the upkeep on the infrastructure it has. So the more stormwater that can be kept on people's properties, the less load there is on the infrastructure, the longer that infrastructure is going to last, less money you have to spend on capital costs of keeping that infrastructure up.
And of course, eventually, everybody in the town will have rain barrels, we know.
I have a number of questions. The first one is, has the state stormwater group developed any kind of zoning bylaw guidelines, sample bylaws rather, that a town might consider implementing, let's say for new development and maybe even existing, especially residential zoning, but all zoning?
That's if I can give you kind of a long answer to that. One way to get that is by the state, the brilliant people at the state thinking those things up. We're kind of taking a different approach. There are groups of towns that have formed into stormwater coalitions, or voluntary groups of town officials that are getting together. There are 10 of them in the Commonwealth right now. And what they're doing at the staff level is figuring those sorts of things out. So there are stormwater coalitions that have model bylaws, model standard operating procedures for how you operate your parks department, model stormwater pollution prevention plans to use. So those exist, and I can certainly give the Stormwater Advisory Committee links to those.
That'd be great. Second question. I have heard some frustration over the costs of this to the local cities and towns. I'm very supportive of the idea of being environmentally sensitive. So it's a good project, but the question is, do we, or has the state formed any kind of rough estimates of what each town might incur to clean up and comply with the MS4 new regulations? Or is this an unfunded mandate and there's really no clue as to what this might cost locally?
When EPA did 2 drafts of this permit back in 2010 and 2011, withdrew that permit, put another draft out in 2014, and EPA finally adopted it in 2016. And when EPA did that, and I'm mentioning EPA, that's the federal EPA, I'm with the State Department of Environmental Protection, just a differentiation there. They came up with some pretty good spreadsheets that estimate the cost for a town. based on things like how many catch basins you have, how many miles of roads. That's the cost for doing the permit. What they didn't calculate was how much you're already spending. So that will depend. We had a group of students from Worcester Polytechnic Institute have been doing stormwater projects since 2014 with some of the other towns in central Massachusetts. And they did a job for a couple of towns where the towns independently figured out how much it was going to cost. And the students used the spreadsheet to figure out how much it was going to cost. And it came out to be pretty close. So I can't say that there's been rigorous testing of EPA's model, but the model, at least from that instance, is pretty good. And you can use that as a way of getting a good estimate for your own town about how much the costs are going to be.
And of course, right now, let me just add this. Right now, in the DPW's budget, they are already planning, and they have been for a bit, is the street cleaning and the cleaning of the drains as well. So that's already being done.
Is it fair to say that having more open space in the community is a benefit in that the surface water, some of it drains down to the aquifers and is filtered, and it is not being addressed directly by the surface runoff that this act addresses? I'm not clear of the difference between surface water and deeper aquifers as to its pollutants.
The reason I was referring to surface waters earlier, that's an artifact of the permit. The permit is there because the Clean Water Act requires anyone discharging into surface waters of the United States to have a permit to do so, just in general. So that's why I was talking about surface waters. There are also impacts to groundwater. The Federal Clean Water Act doesn't address groundwater concerns. The data I've seen, studies I've seen about impervious surface, we used to think that as long as like less than 5 or 10% of a lot was paved, you were okay. What we found, though, is that any amount of impervious surface on a property, 2%, 3%, 9%, 15%, is going to end up degrading the water quality a little bit. In other words, there's no threshold level below which there's no effect. So the less impervious surface you have, the less paving you have, the better it is for your rivers and streams, which is why towns are starting to look more at low-impact development, basically looking at a property and thinking, where are the best places for any houses or commercial facilities to go? How can they be placed in the part of the property that makes the most sense? How can you leave more of it open? But that said, each town makes its own decision about how it handles its open space.
And my last one, a little tongue-in-cheek, is it looked like on your map that the Ashland Reservoir was one of the locations of some of these pollutants. And that's owned by the state. Are you guys going to chip in a little bit to help us build our facility here?
DCR operates that, don't they?
They do.
They are a permittee. They are subject to this permit also. So they're going to have to be doing work, including coordinating with towns.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming to our town. My name is Rob Scher. I'm a member of the Board of Selectmen, and there are actually quite a few members of the board here tonight, so you may hear from them as well. We're one of the, we commissioned this committee, and they've been reporting to us. So one of the things, of course, we're wrestling with, as you might imagine, is how to actually implement this and to pay for it. So I appreciate your perspective on some of the complexities about whether to implement rates to ratepayers as opposed to general taxes. And I really appreciate your comments about the actions that individuals can take versus kind of more large centralized drainage projects. Could you maybe talk about that a little bit more in terms of, it seems like a big chunk of what we can do is education of the public in terms of what they can do to minimize runoff, our stormwater discharge, and improve water quality that they're responsible, as well as businesses. Are you finding that that can be a very significant effort in terms of meeting some of these objectives as opposed to large, expensive infrastructure projects? How does that kind of fall?
Yeah, I think what we're finding is is that having stormwater managed on a site is better than having it shipped off the site. My brother's a civil engineer, younger than I am, but he was still trained at the time that the best thing you could do with stormwater is gather it up as quickly as you can and get it the heck off the property and all. That has impacts
That's
to the
changed
rivers
now,
and streams.
yeah.
So thinking it's changed, spurred mostly by communities around in the Maryland area, around Chesapeake Bay. They've been finding if you keep stormwater on site, instead of running off, the stormwater percolates, infiltrates into the ground. When it does, it reduces the amount of pollution. The pollutants I was talking about, one of them being phosphorus, promotes plant growth. So if you can get that going into the ground, it stays there instead of going to the rivers and streams. So that's
right.
one thing people can
Well, thank
do.
you. One thing, we did vote at our last meeting to join a Stormwater Coalition, so hopefully we'll get those models. The other thing I just wanted to follow up on was, it is effective to do a lot of individual education. Is that usually done within town departments as part of their current budget? Like maybe there's a new emphasis as opposed to everything being at DPW. You mentioned the Board of Health, the schools, things like that. Have you, in your experience, seen towns that are able to kind of decentralize these processes a little bit within existing budgets or priorities for staff?
Yeah, I think it's really going where the skills are. At least I talked to Joe Flanagan in Dedham, who's head of the DPW there. He doesn't really want to spend a lot of time going out and doing public education.
Mm-hmm.
We have an environmental coordinator in Dedham who sort of works across those different town departments. Other towns do in different ways, but they're finding people who have strengths in being able to get information out to people. And one of the things that's so important there is that we all know who polluters are, right? They're the bad people that take methyl ethyl glop or whatever and put it into the rivers and streams the streams turn color and they smell bad and all. The strange thing with stormwater is that it makes
It's everybody, yeah.
I'm a polluter because there's stormwater coming off my residential property. And we get out of the habit of thinking that polluters are bad people. It's like pollution happens wherever you live, and if you can do something
Human
on your
settlements,
property,
right.
like redirect your downspout, so instead of going out to the sidewalk, it goes into your yard. That's a pollution prevention thing to do.
Very
It's a
good,
really
thank you.
idea.
And we all should buy Gene's rain barrels, so that'd be good too, right? All right.
Definitely, we'll need them for the drought during the summer, I'm sure.
I've been sat through a couple of presentations from the Stormwater Advisory Committee in the past, and one of the things that's come up several times is the fact that cities and towns are open to fines and penalties relative to compliance with the MS4. Now, what's unclear is the kind of time frame for implementation of the MS4. So you've got July 1st, 2018 as the operative date at this point in time.
Yes.
So what does that mean? Does that mean what point or how does a town phase in these processes without being subject to fines and penalties? And yes, we're doing a certain amount of work right now. We know we need to ramp it up, but what is that time frame? And at what point does the town get notified you're not in compliance, and who's doing the monitoring?
Yeah, EPA and DEP staff look at the work that you're doing now under the 2003 permit. There were some towns didn't get their annual reports in on time. They were due May 1st last year. We're contacting those towns. May 1st this year is coming up for another time, and we're reminding the towns that required by law to do that work. Also required by the permit to have a locally enforceable mechanism that prohibits people from putting pollutants into your stormwater system. So the agencies are keeping track of those things. The structure of the permit is that if it takes effect on July 1st, and I'll talk about that if in a minute, if it takes effect on July 1st, within the first 90 days is when you make your application to get coverage under the permit. During that first year, you come up with your plan that would show how you're going to meet the requirements of the permit. What I'm getting at is that the requirements of the permit are phased in over time. They don't all hit on day one. So towns need to be nimble enough to where when the permit takes effect to be ready within the first 90 days to do a notice of intent. Next week, or 2 weeks from now, I'm doing some training down southeast Massachusetts on towns about how to fill in the notice of intent. They know that the permit is not in effect yet. They know that the permit's slated to start on July 1st, but maybe it won't. So they're planning ahead.
Right, okay. So if you could speak to the July 1st date, because, correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is that it's an appeal at this point?
Yeah, the permit,
Let's sit down.
the permit was slated to take effect on July 1st, 2017. On June 30th, 2017, DEP got notice from EPA that it was postponing the permit for a year. The reason for that is some people had appealed the permit. There are 5 different parties. Without going into a lot of details, they range from some entities that say that the entire permit is illegal and should be thrown out, to others that say that the permit goes nowhere near far enough to protect the environment. So they've all appealed the permit. EPA, in its letter postponing the permit for a year, said they wanted to enter into alternative dispute resolution, and they've chosen mediation as a method of doing that. I understand that they've started the mediation. I don't know if that mediation will be completed by July 1st. I don't know if the permit appeal will be finished legally by July 1st or not. And it leaves towns in a kind of a difficult situation, because the decisions for when the permit's going to start are in the judicial system. So we'll all hear about that when it happens. In the meantime, DEP believes the prudent thing for towns to do is to start preparing for a July 1st start date. The good thing about the permit is it doesn't require all that work to start in the first year. There's the preparing of the notice of intent, the application, and the stormwater management plan. But so what some towns are doing is getting ready, but not pulling the plug. What some other towns are doing is saying, look, we already are paying for our catch basins. We're already paying for plowing our roads. We're already paying to do good stormwater work for our DPW. So how are we going to fund that work that we're doing now, independent of this new permit? That's a decision each town is making.
If I could quickly add, I'm the town engineer for the town of Ashland. More localized to our town, we have hired a consultant, Kleinfelder, and he's been working on the existing, like the 2016 requirements as it stands now, and they have phased out the costs for the next 5 years, depending on when the requirements are needed to be completed. So that's another quick thing that I wanted to add. Any more questions from the residents? I would like to invite Yolanda to ask her a set of questions that we had. The Stormwater Advisory Committee met, and then we decided these are potential questions that could come up from the residents, and it's good to have it televised. So I'm asking Yolanda to reiterate those.
Good evening, my name is Yolanda Greaves. I'm also a member of the Board of Selectmen, but I also do a local cable show called Around the Clock News for Ashland, so I was asked to help moderate here. So these are questions that we thought we may not, or the public may not think of right now, but we probably should get the answers for these since we have Fred here helping us out tonight. The first is, water from storms has always been here. Why is stormwater suddenly such a big issue, and why do we need to manage stormwater runoff? I think you've addressed some of that, but if you go in maybe a little more in detail.
Yeah, and I think the pollution from stormwater has been there. We were basically concentrating on larger problems. I used to live in California, in Monterey Bay. I'm a surfer. I used to surf at a place called Sewer Peak. It was called Sewer Peak because that's where the outfall was from the sewage plant. It's a great wave, but it was really odd when the water would change temperature when you were there. It was really well worth it, though. It's an excellent place. But what we've done since then is done a good job of cleaning up our wastewater treatment plants. I remember talking with some people up in the northern part of the state. They were remembering when you could tell what day it was by what color the streams ran, because the paper plants were producing paper that color on that particular day. We've done a great job of reducing those pollutants, but many of our rivers and streams don't meet water quality standards. So what do we do about that, especially when we know that the single largest source is stormwater pollution?
Great, thank you. The next question's Ashland streams drain into two different watersheds, the Charles River watershed and the Sudbury River, which is part of the Stuart Company Suasco, thank you, watershed, both of which have some level of impairment. Does that make Ashland's role more difficult and costly?
Yes, because you'd have to meet the requirements for the Charles River and also meet the requirements for the Suasco. The requirements for those are very different. For the Suasco, it's a lot more public information kinds of things. For the Charles River, there's a requirement for a 20-year plan to be able to build structures that reduce pollution. And I just wanted to check my permit here to make sure. Total phosphorus in the Charles. Yes, you're in, like my hometown of Dedham is. So yeah, there are requirements in the permit, additional requirements, not only those 6 minimum control measures, but the requirements for impaired waters and waters that have those TMDLs I was talking about earlier.
I know for myself, when I saw this map, because the red you're saying is areas that are impaired, correct? This is not a question from the piece of paper.
These are areas that we know are impaired for which a comprehensive study called TMDL has not yet been prepared.
Because the other big one is the Hopkinton, is the part of the Hopkinton State Park. Yeah.
Again, we know that it doesn't meet federal and or state water quality standards, but we haven't done the TMDL, gone through that process of figuring out where the pollutants come from. And that, to go really wonky for a second, the TMDL, you end up looking at all the different land uses, high, medium, and low density residential, commercial, industrial, open space, and you figure out how much loading is coming of pollutants from those different uses. And it's sort of like a big spreadsheet of how much pollutants are coming from different areas. There could be a lot coming from agriculture, but agriculture isn't regulated through this permit. Then you would figure out what sort of reductions need to come from high, medium, low density residential and commercial and industrial.
Okay. Next one, the new permit, the 2016 permit, mandates that the town do more stormwater work and at a far greater expense. Can you go into a little more detail about why the change for it?
Yeah, I think as I was explaining earlier, the requirements of the 2016 permit are much more specific than the requirements of the 2003 permit. So for example, for good housekeeping, so things you have to do in town, there's a requirement that their as-built plans for projects that are completed need to indicate stormwater facilities, both the construction period and post-construction period, where they're located on the property, and those need to be kept. Inspections of stormwater facilities need to occur both for construction and post-construction. There needs to be a trash management plan from Parks and Rec for how they're going to handle trash. They also need to come up with a plan to show how they're going to reduce the amount of vegetation that's within 50 feet of rivers and streams. So from DEP's perspective, since we commented on this permit when it was in draft form, the permit has a lot of administrative requirements that DEP thought were not directly connected to reducing stormwater pollution. So we requested the EPA reduce some of those requirements. They did reduce some of them. There's still a lot of administrative reporting requirements here. So, for example, you have to do dry weather sampling at all your outfalls in the first 3 years of the permit. When I asked Joe in Dedham how many outfalls you get, he's very careful to always say, is we got 750 plus or minus. It's hard to know exactly how many you have. We build our outfalls over decades and decades.
Okay. The next one, why isn't the state doing more of this work and or assisting us with some funding?
Well, my sort of, not to make light of this, my waggish answer is you're looking at the entire division of stormwater for DEP.
Wow.
So,
okay.
Another answer for that is since 2012, the state has granted $1.3 million in grants to groups of towns to form stormwater coalitions and figure out how to do this work together. So there's the last round, $300,000 that went to the statewide Stormwater Coalition to develop public education materials that can be used in every town in Massachusetts. $50,000 for a town that's developing out in the Berkshires an illicit discharge detection and elimination program for multiple towns that it's going to share with all other towns. And the third is there's some part of the requirement that says when you do redevelopment of a property, if you haven't got room on the site to put more stormwater into the ground, you can do that work off-site. Good idea. It doesn't say how, but the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission is working on how to do that, so it'll be model ordinance. So I would say that the state's been devoting funds to these stormwater coalitions precisely to do better stormwater management.
Okay. The Board of Selectmen, of which I'm a member, created a Stormwater Advisory Committee, which you're aware of, and the folks that have organized this event, they call themselves SWAC, and they have recommended that the town create a stormwater management utility, also known as an enterprise fund. The SMU would charge fees based on impervious area to pay for the expense of stormwater management. Can you explain to our citizens why they feel that this is the preferred way to address stormwater management and why impervious area is a meaningful basis for the fee?
Yeah, the thing with impervious area is the more paving you have, the more runoff you end up having. And that's just sort of common sense. If you have a single family house, my house is on a 9,000 square foot lot. We've probably got about 3,000 square feet of impervious surface with the house, the patio, and walkways and all. Drive over on Route 1 and there's a Lowe's that has acres and acres of paving. They produce a lot more stormwater than my house does. We all produce some, but that larger area produces a lot more. So I think part of what towns have been looking at is the equitability of either having stormwater paid by taxes, which doesn't include tax-exempt properties, or having it paid by everyone who contributes stormwater to the stormwater system. And that's, each town is making that decision. I know in the last couple of years, Milton adopted a stormwater enterprise fund. Last spring, the towns of Dracut and Chelmsford, one at a representative, the other at an open town meeting, adopted a stormwater enterprise fund too. So it's just a funding choice that towns should be making.
Okay. The Stormwater Advisory Committee is recommending a tiered fee structure, as many cities and towns around the state and country have done. Why is this the common approach?
Yeah, my understanding about tiered fee structures in general is that you could go through the calculation for every property of precisely how much impervious surface it has. My Alex and Annie that live across the street, they've probably got more than my house has, but generally we're equivalent. It takes a lot of work to be that precise about impervious surface. So what a lot of towns are doing is saying, look, we'll just figure out on average how much impervious surface our residents have, and just on average charge a fee based upon that. There's a pull and tug between getting very specific information, precision, and having something that makes sense and that works for everyone. The more precise you get, the more money you pay in administrative overhead, GIS services, to be able to calculate that out. Now, somebody could find out that Alex and Andy across the street have, for example, 4,273 square feet of impervious surface, and Fred and Jen have 3,923. The difference is fairly negligible, so we would both be paying a fee. It's fairly common for towns to do that.
The Stormwater Advisory Committee is recommending a budget that charges a bit more than is necessary to cover each year's expenses and referring to it as retained earnings. They say that retained earnings are necessary to provide for surprises or unknowns due to our aging stormwater infrastructure. Is this common?
Yes, it is. The known unknowns are, you're going to have some part of your stormwater pipes, your catch basins, are going to go bad on you at some time. Your town probably has piping from different decades that are in different shape. Some towns are starting to use television cameras to go through and examine the pipes to see what condition they're in. Remember that dry weather sampling I was talking about earlier? Sometimes it's just groundwater coming into those pipes, which is not necessarily a problem. What it means, though, is you're going to have to go through the expense of going back and testing that outfall again and again and again because it's got a positive dry weather sampling hit. But so it's the capital expenditures that are going to come. The other part is the results of your illicit discharge detection and elimination program. You are going to find things in your stormwater system, whether it's indications of human sewage, whether it's indications of other pollutants that come from wash water, things like that. You're going to find those, and those have an indeterminate cost. The requirements of the permit is that once you know about an illicit discharge, you have to fix it within 60 days or on an expeditious schedule. So the permit requires the town to address that illicit discharge very quickly. It's impossible to estimate how much money that will cost over time.
Okay, thank you. The Stormwater Advisory Committee has also said that the fund could offer incentives at some point in the future. Could you describe some of the things that homeowners and/or business owners can do to help mitigate stormwater and how those incentives might be employed?
Yeah, there was a question earlier about using cisterns or rain barrels. The more you can keep your stormwater on site, the better it is. It doesn't go into the town system. Some people keep rain barrels so they can do their watering during the summer. The rain barrels, they have mosquito guards, varmint guards also, so that the roof leaders go into a tight seal for the rain barrel with an outlet on the bottom you click, screw your hose into and use that for watering. Just keeping stormwater on the site is helpful to do. It reduces pollutants and again doesn't put load on the system for the town. One way of thinking about this is you could just take all your stormwater and put it into the town, but that's your money, all you people paying more money for that sort of thing. It sort of doesn't make sense. So if you have a chance to be able to do something on your property, to use stormwater for something beneficial or just keep it on your property, it's a good idea to do that.
Okay. What else can myself, other members of our board, what else should we know as we're helping our town make this decision in regards to how we're going to deal with and pay for some of these stormwater issues?
Well, I think being sensitive to the relative lack of clarity about the permit and when it's going to be implemented. I think it was Drake last year, they adopted the Stormwater Enterprise Fund, and then they're going to be making a separate decision for setting the fee for that fund. What some towns are doing is considering a Stormwater Enterprise Fund later in the year after we know whether the permit's going to start or not. So being nimble enough to be able to move with that. The second part is, and I think there are relatively small number of towns that have active stormwater advisory committees like Ashland does, but getting information into the hands of people is a really good thing. The permit requires public education materials to 4 different audiences over the life of the permit, 2 messages to each audience. But it's a good idea to get as much information out as you can. On DEP's website, and I'd be happy to send you that link, we've got public education materials that the town can click on, save to your own computers, put your own town seal on it, and use that to get information out to the public. But I think you're already doing a lot of the things that need to do, just more of that. Do you have more of these scheduled?
We don't have any scheduled yet, but we will be having more of these forums. Plus, there's going to be outreach through our farmers market. We're going to have information there. So we are looking at different ways to get the information out to the community because we have a very active community, and I know a lot of people will be watching this via WACA-TV. We get a lot of feedback from that. We're also going to do a special on Around the Clock about this. So we're going to find different ways to get out to the community.
That's good. Your farmer's market's right near the library, right?
Correct, right on Front Street.
It's good. My band played there last year.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was good to be. We had great things to buy. It was wonderful coming out here. I enjoyed it.
So
You don't need to hire me, though.
I guess the last question, what else can our public know? But also, just a question, here in Ashland, we have a lot of homes that are on hills. And sometimes the stormwater that's coming past your home is not all your stormwater. It's from the houses higher up on the hill. What's a way to handle that?
It's a difficult one to handle. The permit requires towns to adopt rules for what happens after the houses are built, how is stormwater managed on the property. And I think the combination of people in your building department and in your conservation commission probably work on the kinds of stormwater structures that work best with hills. It can be a problem.
I think, though, that these are neighborhoods that have been around for 20, 30, 40 years, where some, even some of our newer neighborhoods, they might have done it, but from between those homes and some of the older homes, I think of some of the older streets where they go up on a hill. So what can we tell those people as to how they can help handle it?
I think the best thing, it gets back to publicizing the fact, or even providing incentives once you get your stormwater enterprise fund set up, for people to be able to manage stormwater on site. You've got a choice between having the stormwater run off a driveway and go down into the neighbor's property, or having a trench drain at the bottom that diverts some of that runoff onto your own property. That's a good thing to do. We are getting larger storms, storms that are more intense, but having smaller structures built on your property that can handle the great number of smaller storms that we get will help. And that's, I think people tend to think of either solving the problem or not solving the problem. Is it's binary? It's really not. It's sort of doing some things that will help improve the situation. The best way I've heard it explained, someone asked, so will this permit solve all these water quality problems? And a colleague from Maine said, this permit, in combination with other federal permits and state permits and local bylaws and volunteer actions, will, over time, reduce pollution enough so our rivers and streams are going to be swimmable and fishable.
Great. Well, that was my list of questions. If anybody has any other questions that they'd like to ask. If not, on behalf of the Stormwater Advisory Committee, I'd like to thank you for coming out. Please be on the lookout for more of this information. If you have any specific questions, you can reach out through to the Stormwater Advisory Committee. Fred gave you his email address. We are going to be working to educate everyone a little bit more, and it will ultimately come down to a decision of the voters as to how we handle our stormwater expenses moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you. One thing real quick, just so everybody knows, we will be bringing this to the fall town meeting for the Stormwater Utility Fund potentially. So be ready. We'll have a bunch more public forums. Our committee meetings are generally the first and third Tuesdays of the month. Thank you for your time. We appreciate it.